On the morning of March 19th, 1943, Flight Lieutenant Wilfred Oulton pressed his Handley Page Halifax bomber down to 200 feet above the Bay of Biscay, watching whitecaps blur past his cockpit windows at 170 miles per hour. His navigator, Flying Officer Dennis Walsh, had stopped calling out altitude warnings. They'd been flying this low for 40 minutes, skimming the Atlantic waves like a seabird hunting fish. Oulton was looking for U-boats. Specifically, he was looking for surfaced U-boats, making the transit between German-occupied French ports and their hunting grounds in the North Atlantic. And he was flying at an altitude that 6 months earlier would have been considered suicidal for an anti-submarine patrol aircraft. 3 miles ahead, Oulton spotted what he'd been searching for, a dark shape on the surface, heading northwest at 15 knots. A German submarine, U-boat, 657, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Göllner. The submarine was on the surface, running its diesel engines to recharge batteries after a submerged transit through coastal waters. Göllner's lookouts spotted the Halifax at almost the same moment Oulton saw them. What happened next would have been impossible 8 months earlier. The submarine didn't dive. It opened fire. 4 20mm anti-aircraft guns swiveled toward the approaching bomber. Tracers arced across the water. But Oulton was already committed to his attack run, and he was too low and too fast for the German gunners to track effectively. The Halifax roared over the submarine at masthead height. Oulton's bomb aimer released 6 depth charges in a perfect stick across the U-boat's track. The charges hit the water, sank to their preset depth of 25 feet, and detonated in sequence. The explosions lifted U-657's stern out of the water. The submarine's hull buckled. Water poured into the engine room through ruptured seams. Göllner ordered his crew to abandon ship. 23 minutes after Oulton's attack, U-boat 657 slipped beneath the Atlantic waves and sank in 400 fathoms of water. 46 German submariners made it into life rafts. 3 died in the attack. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Oulton's attack was not remarkable because it succeeded. What made it significant was that it represented a complete reversal of anti-submarine warfare doctrine. For the first 2 years of the war, RAF Coastal Command bombers hunted U-boats from altitudes between 1,000 and 3,000 feet. They approached targets cautiously, lined up careful bombing runs, and released their weapons from safe distances that gave U-boat crews 20 to 30 seconds to crash dive before the aircraft arrived overhead. The results were catastrophic for the attackers. Between 1939 and mid-1942, RAF Coastal Command flew hundreds of thousands of patrol hours and attacked hundreds of U-boats. They sank fewer than a dozen. The depth charges usually fell on empty water because the submarine had already submerged, and the bombers themselves were vulnerable. Attacking from high altitude meant flying straight and level for extended periods. German flak gunners had plenty of time to aim. Coastal Command lost dozens of aircraft to anti-aircraft fire from submarines that subsequently escaped undamaged. By the summer of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. In June 1942 alone, U-boats sank 144 Allied ships, totaling over 700,000 tons. The convoy system helped protect shipping, but submarines still found targets. And when RAF bombers encountered U-boats, they rarely achieved anything, beyond forcing a temporary dive. The British Admiralty and RAF Coastal Command knew something had to change. They had the aircraft, they had the weapons, they had brave crews willing to fly long, dangerous patrols over the Atlantic, but they didn't have the tactics that would let those weapons work. The problem was physics and human reaction time. A U-boat on the surface could dive in 30 to 45 seconds from the moment the order was given. The diving process was practiced until crews could execute it in their sleep. Lookouts would spot an aircraft. The alarm would sound. Crew members would pour down the hatches. The vents would open. The ballast tanks would flood. The submarine would slip beneath the surface. If a bomber was approaching from 3,000 feet, the U-boat commander had at least 45 seconds from first visual contact to get his boat underwater. The bomber's approach was visible from miles away. The aircraft had to descend, line up, steady on course, and then release weapons. By the time depth charges hit the water, the submarine was already submerged and beginning to dive deeper. Depth charges set for 25 feet would explode harmlessly above a submarine that had reached 60 or 70 feet. The mathematics were brutal. At 3,000 feet altitude, a bomber traveling at 160 miles per hour covered roughly 1 mile while descending to attack height. During that mile of approach, the U-boat had time to see the threat, sound the alarm, and begin its dive. The submarine always won that race. Something fundamental had to change, and the answer came from an unlikely source. Combat analysis by scientists who had never flown an aircraft or commanded a submarine. The British Operational Research Section was established in 1941 to apply scientific analysis to military problems. The section included physicists, mathematicians, and statisticians who examined combat data to find patterns that frontline commanders might miss. One analyst, a physicist named Patrick Blackett, studied every coastal command attack on U-boats from 1939 through mid-1942. Blackett compiled meticulous records: aircraft type, altitude, approach direction, weapon type, depth charge settings, weather conditions, sea state, time of day, and outcome. He found something remarkable. The handful of successful attacks shared a common characteristic. They were all conducted from altitudes below 500 feet. When bombers attacked from very low altitude, U-boats didn't have time to dive. The attacks happened too fast. A bomber at 200 feet, traveling at 170 miles per hour, could cross from the horizon to overhead in less than 20 seconds. That wasn't enough time for a U-boat to dive. The submarine crew would see the aircraft, sound the alarm, but before they could even get below decks, the bomber would be overhead releasing weapons. Blackett's analysis went further. He calculated that attacking from 50 to 200 feet reduced the U-boat's effective warning time from 45 seconds to 15 seconds or less. At that altitude, the bomber came in so fast and so low that submarine lookouts couldn't spot it until it was nearly on top of them. The curvature of the Earth and the limited visibility from a submarine's conning tower meant an aircraft at 200 feet was invisible beyond about 3 miles. At 170 miles per hour, 3 miles took 63 seconds to cover. But the actual visible approach time was much shorter because the aircraft didn't become clearly identifiable until it was within 2 miles, sometimes less in poor visibility. Blackett presented his findings to Coastal Command Headquarters in early 1942. The response was skepticism. Flying at 200 feet over the Atlantic seemed insane. The aircraft would be vulnerable to every wave, every wind gust, every moment of pilot inattention. And if anything went wrong with the aircraft, there would be no altitude to recover. The bomber would simply hit the water. Coastal Command's experienced pilots thought low-level attacks were suicide. The ocean was unforgiving. One mistake at 200 feet meant instant death for the entire crew. But Blackett had the data. Low-altitude attacks succeeded. High-altitude attacks failed. The numbers were undeniable. In August 1942, Coastal Command authorized experimental low-level tactics for selected squadrons. The crews were volunteers who understood the risks. Flight Lieutenant Wilfred Oulton was one of those volunteers. He was 24 years old in 1942, born in Winnipeg, Canada, and had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940. He'd been flying anti-submarine patrols since 1941 with 206 Squadron RAF, operating Lockheed Hudsons from bases in Northern Ireland. Oulton was an experienced pilot with over 1,000 hours of coastal patrol time. He'd attacked submarines before using conventional high-altitude tactics. He'd never sunk one. The submarines always dived before his depth charges arrived. When 206 Squadron transitioned to low-level tactics in September 1942, Oulton volunteered for the new approach. The training was intense. Pilots had to learn to fly for hours at altitudes between 50 and 300 feet, maintaining precise height control while navigating over featureless ocean. There were no visual references, no landmarks, just water. The altimeter became the most important instrument in the cockpit, and standard altimeters weren't accurate enough at very low altitudes. They could be off by 50 feet or more. That meant a pilot thinking he was at 200 feet might actually be at 150 or even 100. At 100 feet over a rolling Atlantic, a single large wave could reach up and swat an aircraft out of the sky. Coastal Command installed radio altimeters in aircraft assigned to low-level patrol work. Radio altimeters measured height by bouncing radio signals off the surface and calculating the time delay. They were accurate to within 10 feet, which gave pilots the precision they needed. But even with accurate altimeters, flying that low required extraordinary concentration. Pilots flew for hours at a time, eyes constantly moving between the altimeter, the compass, the airspeed indicator, and the horizon. Any lapse meant potential disaster. One pilot described it as being in a trance. You couldn't think about anything except flying. Your entire focus narrowed to maintaining altitude and heading. The aircraft used for low-level anti-submarine work included several types. The Lockheed Hudson was an American-built light bomber adapted for maritime patrol. It carried depth charges and had enough range for patrols lasting 6 to 8 hours. The Handley Page, Halifax, and Vickers Wellington were heavier bombers with greater weapons capacity. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, operated by both RAF and US Navy squadrons, had exceptional range, allowing patrols deep into the mid-Atlantic, and the short Sunderland flying boat could land on water to rescue survivors or refuel from supply ships. All these aircraft were modified with improved radar, additional guns, and strengthened bomb bays to carry heavier depth charges. The weapons themselves also evolved. Early depth charges were cylindrical devices weighing between 250 and 450 pounds, filled with Torpex explosive. Torpex was 50% more powerful than TNT and specifically designed for underwater blast effects. The charges were set to detonate at specific depths using hydrostatic pistols, pressure-sensitive triggers that fired when the weapon reached the preset depth. For low-level attacks, Coastal Command changed the depth settings. Instead of detonating at 100 or 150 feet, which gave a diving submarine time to get deep, the new charges were set to explode at 25 feet. That shallow setting meant the explosion would catch a submarine that was just beginning its dive, when it was most vulnerable. The shallow depth also concentrated the blast effect upward, maximizing damage to the submarine's pressure hull. But there was a problem with dropping depth charges from very low altitude. The weapons didn't have time to arm themselves. Standard depth charges used mechanical arming mechanisms that required the weapon to fall for several seconds before becoming live. This safety feature prevented accidental detonation if a charge broke loose during flight. When dropped from 200 feet, the charges hit the water before they were fully armed and sometimes failed to explode. The solution was developed at HMS Hornbill, a Royal Navy research station in Scotland. Engineers designed a new pistol mechanism that armed instantly upon release, detonated based solely on depth. The Mark 17 depth charge entered service in late 1942 and became the standard weapon for low-level attacks. It weighed 420 pounds, carried 275 pounds of Torpex, and could be set to detonate at depths from 25 to 50 feet. 6 of these charges, dropped in a stick pattern across a submarine's track, created a lethal zone roughly 150 feet long and 70 feet wide. If the submarine was anywhere in that zone, the blast would rupture the pressure hull. The pressure hull was the submarine's critical structure. U-boats had an outer hull for streamlining and an inner pressure hull that contained the crew and kept the ocean out. The pressure hull was made of steel between 3/4 of an inch and 1 inch thick, designed to withstand pressure at depths down to 750 feet. But the hull's strength was designed for external pressure pushing inward, not explosive. Shock waves. A depth charge detonating within 100 feet created a pressure wave that could buckle or crack the pressure hull. Water would flood in through the damage. The submarine would lose buoyancy, control, and sink. Even near misses caused damage. The shock wave from a depth charge explosion traveled through water much more efficiently than through air. A charge detonating 50 feet from a submarine transmitted enough force to break welds, damage machinery, crack battery casings, and disable systems. A submarine that survived a near-miss attack might find its batteries leaking chlorine gas, its diesel engines inoperative, or its diving planes jammed. That kind of damage forced the submarine to surface, making it vulnerable to follow-up attacks. By the fall of 1942, several coastal command squadrons were operational with low-level tactics. 206 Squadron, 502 Squadron, and 120 Squadron were flying regular patrols over the point, Bay of Biscay, the body of water between western France and northern Spain. The Bay of Biscay was critical terrain in the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats, based at French ports in Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux, had to transit across the bay to reach the Atlantic convoy routes. The transit took 3 to 5 days depending on the submarine's speed and route. During that transit, U-boats were vulnerable. They had to run on the surface or at snorkel depth to charge batteries and make good speed. Submerged, a U-boat could only travel at 4 or 5 knots and had limited battery endurance. To reach their operational areas quickly, submarines ran on the surface whenever possible, using their diesel engines. That made them visible to aircraft. Part 2 continuation. RAF Coastal Command concentrated its air patrols over the Bay of Biscay precisely because U-boats had to cross that water. The patrols operated in a systematic pattern designed to maximize coverage. Aircraft would fly outbound tracks spaced 15 to 20 miles apart, then return on parallel tracks. Multiple aircraft operating simultaneously created a web of overlapping patrol zones. A U-boat transiting the bay had a high probability of being spotted. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, issued specific instructions to submarine commanders: cross the Bay of Biscay submerged whenever possible. If forced to surface, post extra lookouts. If an aircraft appears, dive immediately. Do not wait to confirm aircraft type or distance. Dive on first sight. These instructions made sense when aircraft attacked from high altitude. A U-boat that dived immediately would be safe underwater before the bomber could complete its attack run. But the instructions became counterproductive when aircraft started attacking from masthead height. A submarine that began diving the moment lookouts spotted an aircraft at low level would still be on the surface or barely submerged when the bomber arrived overhead. The dive sequence took 30 to 40 seconds. At low altitude, the bomber's approach time was less than 20 seconds. The submarine couldn't dive fast enough. Dönitz received reports of this problem by late 1942. U-boat commanders radioed that aircraft were appearing suddenly at wave-top height with no warning. The boats would sound the alarm and begin diving, but the aircraft would already be overhead, dropping depth charges before the conning tower was even submerged. Several U-boats were damaged in these attacks. Some were sunk. In December 1942, Dönitz made a controversial tactical decision. He ordered U-boats to stay on the surface and fight back with anti-aircraft guns rather than diving when attacked by single aircraft. The reasoning was logical. If diving no longer guaranteed safety, perhaps aggressive defense would work better. U-boats carried increasingly heavy anti-aircraft armament by late 1942. Early warboats had a single 20mm cannon. By 1943, many boats carried 2 twin-mount 20mm guns plus a 37mm cannon. Some carried 4 20mm guns. That was substantial firepower. A bomber flying straight at a U-boat at 200 feet made an easy target. The German gunners had 10 to 15 seconds of firing time as the aircraft approached. If they could hit the bomber's engines or crew, the aircraft would crash into the sea. The new tactics created a brutal dynamic. British bombers flew at suicidal altitudes to attack before submarines could dive. German submarines stayed on the surface and fought. Gambling, they could shoot down the attacker before the depth charges hit. The Bay of Biscay became a killing ground where aircraft and submarines fought to the death at point-blank range. Flight Lieutenant Dennis Walsh of 502 Squadron described the experience in his combat report from January 19, 1943. He'd spotted a U-boat on the surface at 12 miles range. He descended to 150 feet and opened his throttles to maximum power. The submarine's lookout saw him at 5 miles. The boat didn't dive. Instead, it opened fire. Ballston watched tracers arcing toward his Wellington bomber. His front gunner returned fire with a .5-inch Browning machine gun. Rounds from the submarine stitched across his starboard wing, punching holes through the fabric covering. Ballston held his course. At 1 mile, the submarine's anti-aircraft fire intensified. His navigator called that they were taking hits in the fuselage. Ballston could see men running on the submarine's deck, loading weapons, firing continuously. At a 1/4 mile, his bomb aimer called ready. Ballston pressed his release button. 6 depth charges fell away in sequence. The Wellington roared over the submarine at 100 feet. Ballston could see the German crew, clearly, see their faces, see them tracking him with their guns. The depth charges hit the water 20 feet ahead of the submarine's bow. The submarine was traveling at 15 knots, which meant it covered 22 feet per second. The charges sank to 25 feet in approximately 2 seconds. The submarine's bow passed directly over the first charge just as it detonated. The explosion lifted the bow out of the water. The pressure hull buckled. The forward torpedo room flooded instantly. The submarine's angle became steeper as the bow filled with water. The stern rose. The propellers came partially out of the water. The crew abandoned ship. Ballston circled, watching the submarine sink. His Wellington had taken over 30 hits from small-caliber rounds. The starboard engine was losing oil pressure. 1 fuel tank was holed and leaking. His rear gunner had shrapnel wounds in his leg, but they'd sunk the submarine. U-boat 187, under Captain Lieutenant Ralph Munich, went down with 18 crew members. 27 survived and were rescued by a Spanish fishing vessel 3 hours later. This kind of engagement became routine by early 1943. Aircraft and submarines fought at ranges measured in hundreds of feet. The crews could see each other. They could see the expressions on faces, see the muzzle flashes from guns, see the moment when depth charges hit water or when anti-aircraft rounds tore through aluminum skin. It was aerial combat at its most primitive and deadly. The casualty rates reflected the brutality. Coastal Command lost 67 aircraft over the Bay of Biscay between January and August 1943. Some were shot down by U-boat gunners. Others crashed into the ocean during low-altitude maneuvers. A few were lost to mechanical failures that would have been survivable at higher altitude, but proved fatal at 200 feet where there was no room to recover. But the U-boats suffered worse. Between January and August 1943, Coastal Command sank 47 German submarines in the Bay of Biscay and adjacent waters. 47 U-boats in 8 months. That was more submarines destroyed in that single area during that period than had been sunk by aircraft in the entire Atlantic during the previous 2 years of the war. The transformation was complete. Low-level tactics had changed anti-submarine warfare from an ineffective, harassing effort into a campaign that was systematically destroying the U-boat force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The impact on the Battle of the Atlantic was immediate and measurable. U-boat operational effectiveness depended on getting submarines safely to and from their patrol areas. Every boat that was sunk in transit was a boat that never reached the convoy routes. Every boat damaged in the Bay of Biscay had to return to port for repairs, losing weeks of operational time. By the spring of 1943, German submarine losses were exceeding replacement rates. The Germans were building new boats as fast as their shipyards could work, but those boats were being sunk faster than they could be deployed. Admiral Dönitz tracked the statistics carefully. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were lost throughout the Atlantic theatre. 15 of those were sunk in the Bay of Biscay by aircraft using low-level tactics. Dönitz called May 1943 Black May in his war diary. The losses were unsustainable. At that rate, the entire operational U-boat force would be destroyed within 12 months. He considered various responses. He tried grouping submarines together for transit, creating mutual defense with combined anti-aircraft fire. That tactic failed because grouped submarines made easier targets and couldn't maneuver independently. He tried routing submarines around the Bay of Biscay, forcing them to transit through waters west of Ireland. That added days to the journey and increased fuel consumption, reducing time on patrol. He equipped boats with radar detectors so they'd have warning when aircraft approached. That worked briefly until Allied aircraft changed radar frequencies. In September 1943, Dönitz ordered most U-boats to abandon the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely. The losses had become prohibitive. The submarines couldn't reach their operational areas without suffering crippling attrition during transit. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't over, but the tide had turned decisively against the U-boats, and a significant part of that turn came from aircraft flying at altitudes that seemed insane, pressing attacks at ranges where the crews could see each other's faces. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic depended on multiple factors: improved convoy tactics, better escort ships, advanced radar, code breaking, intelligence from ultra-decrypts, and escort carriers that brought air cover to mid-ocean all contributed. But the low-level anti-submarine tactics developed in 1942 and 1943 eliminated the U-boat safe havens. Submarines could no longer transit across the Bay of Biscay with reasonable confidence of survival. Every crossing became a potentially fatal gamble. The statistics from August 1943 illustrate the transformation. That month, Coastal Command flew 3,216 sorties over the Bay of Biscay. Aircraft spotted 81 U-boats. They attacked 62 of them. They sank 11 and damaged 23 others severely enough to force them back to port. That was an 18% kill rate on attacked submarines and a 37% mission kill rate when including boats forced to abort their patrols. Compare that to August 1941, before low-level tactics. Coastal Command had flown comparable numbers of sorties. They'd spotted fewer submarines because U-boats could transit on the surface more freely. When they did attack, they sank 1 submarine and damaged 3, a 2% kill rate. The difference was entirely attributable to tactics, to the decision to press attacks from altitudes between 50 and 300 feet, where U-boats couldn't dive in time. The human cost of implementing those tactics fell heavily on Coastal Command crews. Flying for 6 to 8 hours at 200 feet over the Atlantic required intense concentration. Pilots developed physical and mental exhaustion from the stress. Many experienced chronic back pain from holding their bodies rigid during long, low-altitude flights. Some developed vision problems from staring at instruments for hours. The psychological strain was enormous. Every minute at low altitude carried the possibility of sudden death. A moment's inattention, a mechanical failure, a rogue wave, and the aircraft would hit the water at 170 miles per hour. At that speed, hitting water was like hitting concrete. No one survived. Squadron leader Wilfred Oulton, who sank U-boat 657 in March 1943, flew 87 combat missions with 206 Squadron before being promoted to command 502 Squadron in June 1943. He flew another 61 missions as squadron commander. He survived the war and reached the rank of Air Vice Marshal in the Royal Air Force. In his post-war memoir, he wrote about the experience of low-level anti-submarine patrols. He described the constant awareness of mortality, the knowledge that any mistake would be fatal, and the strange intimacy of attacking submarines at such close range. He wrote that you could see the submarine crew, see them loading guns, see them firing, see them diving for cover when your depth charges hit the water. It wasn't like bombing from altitude where the target was abstract. At 200 feet, everything was personal. Oulton also wrote about the satisfaction of knowing the tactics worked. For 2 years, Coastal Command had flown patrol after patrol with minimal results. Submarines escaped, ships were sunk, and the aircraft crews felt they were accomplishing nothing. The switch to low-level tactics changed that. Crews saw submarines explode, saw them sink, saw German sailors in the water. They knew their missions mattered. That knowledge sustained them through the exhaustion and fear. The German submariners who survived attacks by low-level aircraft described the experience as terrifying. Oberleutnant Zur C. Herbert Werner commanded U-boat 230 and survived 3 separate air attacks in the Bay of Biscay during 1943. He wrote about it in his post-war memoir, Iron Coffins. Werner described spotting an aircraft at what he estimated was 2 miles distance. He ordered the boat to dive. The alarm sounded. The crew poured below. The vents opened. The boat began to submerge. The aircraft appeared overhead before the conning tower was even underwater. Werner saw the depth charges falling. He threw himself down the hatch. The charges detonated while the submarine was at 15 feet depth, just beginning its dive. The explosions felt like a giant hammer striking the hull. Werner was thrown against the bulkhead. Light fixtures shattered. Gauges cracked. The boat shuddered. Water sprayed from multiple small cracks in the pressure hull. The electric motors shorted out. The boat lost power and began sinking. Werner's crew fought to control the descent using manual ballast controls. They arrested the sink at 230 feet, but the damage was severe. The main ballast pumps were inoperable. One battery compartment was flooded with seawater, creating chlorine gas as the salt water reacted with battery acid. The crew had to wear breathing apparatus. Werner managed to surface the boat after dark using emergency ballast procedures. He limped back to St. Nazaire on diesel power with half his crew suffering from chlorine gas exposure. U-Boat 230 spent 6 weeks under repair. Werner wrote that the speed of low-level attacks was psychologically devastating. There was no time to think, no time to execute proper procedure, no time to do anything except react. The aircraft appeared and attacked within seconds. The submarine crew had no opportunity to defend themselves effectively. They could only endure the attack and hope to survive. That sense of helplessness was new for German submariners. Earlier in the war, U-boats had hunted Allied shipping with near impunity. Now they were the hunted. The psychological impact contributed to declining morale throughout the U-boat force. By late 1943, German submarine crews understood they were fighting a losing battle. The statistics were undeniable. More than half of all U-boat sailors who served during World War II died. 28,000 men out of 40,000. A 70% casualty rate. Those numbers became known within the U-boat service. Men accepted orders knowing they probably wouldn't survive the war. Admiral Dönitz continued to send submarines on patrol because Hitler demanded it. The Führer believed U-boats could still influence the war by tying down Allied resources, forcing the Allies to dedicate ships and aircraft to convoy protection. Dönitz knew better. By 1944, U-boats were barely effective. They were being sunk faster than they could sink Allied shipping. But orders were orders. The boats went to sea, and Coastal Command aircraft continued hunting them using the tactics developed in 1942. The low-level anti-submarine campaign continued through 1944 and into 1945. By the final months of the war, U-boats rarely attempted to transit the Bay of Biscay on the surface. They made the crossing entirely submerged, moving slowly on, electric power, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries. That caution reduced losses but also reduced operational effectiveness. Submarines spent so much time and battery power on careful transit that they had less endurance for actual patrol operations. Some boats spent more time traveling to and from patrol areas than they spent on station looking for targets. The Battle of the Atlantic officially ended May 8, 1945, with Germany's surrender. The final accounting showed that Allied aircraft had sunk 163 German U-boats during the war. Coastal Command was responsible for 192 of those kills. The majority occurred after the adoption of low-level tactics in late 1942. The transformation from high-altitude patrol work to masthead height attacks changed anti-submarine warfare fundamentally. It proved that altitude, which traditionally meant safety, could be abandoned when tactical requirements demanded it. The crews who flew those missions understood they were taking extraordinary risks. They flew at heights where any mechanical problem, any moment of pilot error, any unlucky hit from defensive fire would be instantly fatal. They did it anyway because the tactics worked. The mathematics were simple and brutal. At 3,000 feet, U-boats escaped. At 200 feet, U-boats died. Coastal Command's operational research analysts calculated that low-level attacks were 11 times more likely to result in a submarine kill than high-altitude attacks. 11 times. That figure justified every risk, every lost aircraft, every crew that flew into the water. Patrick Blackett, the physicist who had analyzed the original data and recommended low-level tactics, received a Nobel Prize in Physics in 1948 for his work on cosmic rays. But many who knew him considered his real contribution to have been his operational research during the war. His analysis of anti-submarine tactics saved thousands of merchant sailors' lives and helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. Blackett's work demonstrated that scientific analysis could solve military problems. The military services traditionally relied on experience, intuition, and established doctrine. Blackett showed that careful examination of data could reveal solutions that contradicted conventional wisdom. The recommendation to fly at 200 feet over the Atlantic seemed insane to experienced pilots, but the data showed it worked. The data was correct. After the war, every major military force established operational research units modelled on the British example. The United States Navy created the Operations Evaluation Group. The Air Force established the Air Force Operations Analysis Office. The Army formed similar units. All were based on the principle that rigorous analysis of combat data could improve tactical effectiveness. That principle originated with Patrick Blackett's study of anti-submarine attacks in 1941 and 1942. The legacy of low-level anti-submarine tactics extended beyond World War II. Modern maritime patrol aircraft still use low-altitude tactics when prosecuting submarine contacts. The specific altitudes have changed, the sensors are different, the weapons are more sophisticated, but the principle remains. Get close, attack fast, don't give the submarine time to react. The P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft that served with the United States Navy from 1962 until 2019 regularly conducted low-altitude anti-submarine patrols. The P-8 Poseidon that replaced the Orion uses different tactics because of its jet engines, but still emphasizes rapid attack profiles that give submarines minimal warning. The tactical revolution that began over the Bay of Biscay in 1942 continues to influence maritime warfare 80 years later. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos. On your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.